The early morning light hadn't even warmed the horizon when I stepped outside to collect my coffee, only to be met by a sight that immediately made my heart race. My sprawling ranch, a place I had poured my soul into, a sanctuary of open spaces and wild freedom, had been marked by the HOA as community land. Yes, community land. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief as I noticed a group of stern-faced officials congregating near the old barn, clipboards in hand, as if they were inspecting a public park rather than a private ranch passed down through generations. I always knew that my way of life didn't quite fit the cookie-cutter suburban mold of our county's new developments, but I'd never imagined someone would try to claim my property for the community good. The letter had arrived just last week, a terse notice declaring that, due to recent zoning changes and a so-called community benefit analysis, my 150-acre ranch was now to be managed as community land. The HOA's decision was as shocking as it was infuriating, and as I scrolled through the notice, my pulse quickened. They argued that the sprawling pastures, the grazing fields, and even the weather barn would serve as an open-air park for all residents. It was a clear violation of property rights, a usurpation of something that was mine by blood and sweat. That morning, fueled by a mix of disbelief and righteous anger, I knew that I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I had spent decades cultivating this land, turning rugged acreage into a vibrant ranch where cattle roamed free and the sky stretched wide above. The thought of losing control over it, having strangers wander through my private fields and trample over my legacy, was intolerable. I needed to send a message that I wasn't just a passive bystander. I was the owner, the caretaker, and I was ready to defend what was mine. I hatched a plan as unconventional as it was decisive. If the HOA wanted community land, then they'd get one. I decided to install a series of electrified fences around the perimeter of my ranch, not to hurt anyone, but as a powerful deterrent and a clear signal that this land was still under my control. I could almost hear the irony. While they prided themselves on bureaucracy and paperwork, I was about to let technology and a bit of high-voltage ingenuity do the talking. As the morning progressed, with the HOA's declaration hanging in the air like a challenge, I resolved to act. Today, as the first rays of sunlight bathed my fields in gold, I would transform my ranch into a fortress of self-assertion, a place where any attempt to claim it as community land would be met with an electrifying surprise. And that surprise would not only protect my legacy, but also expose the absurdity of trying to impose collective control over what is rightfully private. Oak Valley County was a patchwork of rolling hills and endless fields, where ranches spanned acres and the spirit of independence still thrived amid modern developments. My ranch, known as Silver Spur Ranch, had been in my family for 3 generations, a legacy of hard work, perseverance, and a deep connection to the land. It was here that cattle grazed under wide, open skies, and where the rhythm of life was dictated not by the clock but by the seasons. The sprawling property boasted a rustic farmhouse, several barns, and a labyrinth of pastures and orchards that I'd nurtured over the years. In stark contrast to this free-roaming way of life was the nearby suburban development, an area increasingly dominated by tidy lawns, uniform houses, and a homeowners association that ruled with rigid precision. The HOA was notorious in the region for its strict enforcement of zoning laws and aesthetic guidelines. They prided themselves on maintaining order and uniformity, often at the expense of personal freedoms and individual property rights. It was in this context that my ranch was thrust into the spotlight. At the heart of the controversy was the HOA board, a group of local officials more concerned with meeting quotas and ticking boxes than with understanding the history and rights of long-standing landowners. Among them was Karen Whitfield, infamously dubbed HOA Karen by residents for her uncompromising stance on every minor infraction. Karen was a woman in her late 40s who carried herself with an air of moral superiority. With a clipboard perpetually at her side and an unyielding gaze, she had built her reputation on strict enforcement of the community's rules. To her, every stray hedge, every unsightly structure, and yes, Even a privately owned ranch that didn't conform to her narrow vision was a problem that needed to be solved by the board. I, on the other hand, was a man who believed in the value of tradition, innovation, and personal freedom. As the current owner and caretaker of Silver Spur Ranch, I had always viewed my property as more than just land. It was an extension of my identity. I had modernized parts of the ranch with eco-friendly technologies, but I'd always maintained a respect for the rugged beauty of the terrain. I knew every inch of my property, from the gnarled oak trees dotting the landscape to the winding dirt roads that led to secret fishing spots along the creek. When the HOA's letter arrived declaring my ranch community land, it felt like an affront to everything I'd built and cherished. The board argued that my ranch could serve as an open-air park, a communal resource for local residents. But to me, that was a blatant disregard for my family's legacy and my hard-earned rights. I had invested blood, sweat, and tears into turning this land into a sanctuary, a place of both beauty and self-reliance. The physical setting of Silver Spur Ranch was a blend of natural beauty and rugged practicality. Wide open pastures met winding trails, and the farmhouse, though weathered by time, stood as a proud testament to the enduring spirit of the land. It was a place where the freedom of the open range was celebrated, and where every sunrise and sunset painted a picture of raw, untamed beauty. This was not the kind of place that could be tamed by bureaucratic edicts. Karen Whitfield, with her penchant for order and her relentless pursuit of conformity, saw my ranch as nothing more than an eyesore, a relic of a past that didn't belong in her modern vision of community perfection. Her latest move, declaring my property as community land, was a calculated attack meant to force me into submission and to transform my private sanctuary into a public spectacle. Little did she know that I had a plan to defend my rights, a plan that involved taking back control in the most electrifying way possible. The fallout from the HOA's declaration hit me like a freight train. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, emails from the board, angry texts from neighbors who had mixed feelings about the decision, and even a few supportive messages from longtime ranchers who understood the value of private property. I spent hours poring over the HOA's bylaws and property records, trying to make sense of how they could possibly justify turning Silver Spur Ranch into community land. The answer was as infuriating as it was clear. They viewed individual property rights as secondary to their vision of a homogenized neighborhood. I began to receive anonymous tips from other residents who suspected that the HOA board, under pressure to boost property values in the new subdivision, had been overreaching in its enforcement. The more I dug, the more I realized that my case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader trend of intrusive oversight by the board, spearheaded by none other than Karen Whitfield. With mounting evidence and a growing sense of injustice, I resolved that I would not be a passive victim. Determined to defend my rights and my heritage, I convened a meeting with a few trusted neighbors. Over late-night calls and secretive meetups on the back porch of my ranch, we discussed the outrageous move by the HOA and brainstormed ways to fight back. That's when I decided on the course of action that would change everything. I would install electrified fences around my property, not as a weapon to harm anyone, but as a clear, non-lethal message that my ranch was off-limits. I would protect it with a modern solution that even the most bureaucratic minds couldn't ignore. I spent the next few days planning meticulously. I researched the best materials, consulted with experts, and even got quotes from a few contractors. The plan was simple yet revolutionary. Retrofit my existing perimeter fence with a state-of-the-art electrified system that would deliver a harmless but unmistakable shock to anyone who dared trespass. It was designed to be a deterrent, a way to safeguard my land while also sending a message that private property rights were not for sale. I began the installation under cover of darkness, working quietly in the vast expanse of my ranch. The process was both physically demanding and emotionally charged. Every bolt I tightened and every wire I connected was a small act of defiance against the HOA's unjust intrusion. As the electrified fence began to take shape, I could feel the weight of history on my shoulders, the legacy of my family, the countless hours spent tending to the land, and the unyielding spirit of freedom that had defined Silver Spur Ranch. Word of my actions spread quickly. Neighbors, initially skeptical, began to murmur their support. "He's fighting back," one person texted to a community group. Others, who had long been frustrated by the HOA's overreach, saw my electrified fence as a beacon of resistance. Social media buzzed with posts and hashtags like #RanchRights and #ElectricJustice, each one a rallying cry for the right to protect one's property against arbitrary power. As I tightened the final connections on the fence, I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of the situation. The HOA had tried to claim my ranch as community land to boost property values and enforce a narrow vision of suburban order. In response, I had transformed my property into a modern fortress, one that was as much a symbol of my defiance as it was a practical measure to secure what was rightfully mine. I knew that once the electrified fence was activated, any attempt by the HOA or its cronies to encroach on my land would be met with a very clear and very electric message. The tension was building to a boiling point, and every shared post and whispered conversation confirmed it. This was no longer just about a disputed property designation. It was a battle for the very soul of our community. And as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the HOA board, I felt a fierce determination swell within me. The time had come to show that in Silver Spur Ranch, the rights of a private landowner, steeped in history and fortified by innovation, would never be trampled by bureaucratic overreach. In the wake of my electrified fence installation, tensions in Oakwood Meadows reached unprecedented levels. Social media lit up with the story of how I had taken a stand against the HOA's unjust declaration of my ranch as community land. Hashtags like #RanchRights, #ElectricJustice, and #StandUpForFreedom quickly went viral. Neighbors who had long been subdued by the oppressive nature of the HOA suddenly found their voices, sharing their own stories of abuse and arbitrary enforcement. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting live from the outskirts of my property. Reporters interviewed residents who expressed shock and admiration. "I can't believe they tried to take his land away," one neighbor exclaimed on camera, his eyes wide with disbelief. Another resident commented, "This is a clear example of how personal property rights should never be compromised by bureaucrats who don't understand the value of independence." The narrative was evolving rapidly. What had started as a petty power grab was now a rallying cry for every landowner in the community. The HOA board, already reeling from past controversies, was thrown into chaos. Emergency meetings were convened behind closed doors, and board members, who had once blindly supported Karen Whitfield's decisions, began to realize that the community was no longer willing to accept such overreach. Internal documents leaked online revealed that the board had been under immense pressure to increase property values by enforcing conformity, but that their methods had become increasingly heavy-handed. Many residents expressed outrage that the very system meant to protect property rights was now being used as a tool for control. Karen Whitfield, the face of the HOA's strict enforcement, found herself under intense scrutiny. Her emails and reports, once considered sacrosanct by the board, were now being questioned in heated town hall meetings and online forums. Neighbors began posting screenshots of her messages, pointing out inconsistencies and overreactions that painted a picture of a woman who was more interested in controlling her community than in protecting it. "She's been abusing her power for years," one post read. "It's time we take back our rights." The digital evidence, combined with my own documented proof of the electrified fence installation, became a potent symbol of resistance. At one particularly charged public meeting, held in the local community center, residents gathered to demand reform. The room was filled with a palpable energy as people shared stories of fines, warnings, and intrusive inspections. One elderly farmer recounted how he'd once been fined for having a fence that wasn't up to HOA standards, while a young couple shared how they had to remove their personalized mailbox to avoid drawing attention. It was clear that the HOA's policies had long suppressed the individuality of the community, and my stand had become the catalyst for change. As the pressure mounted, I received messages from allies beyond Oakwood Meadows, neighbors from adjacent communities, local advocacy groups, and even legal experts who argued that my right to defend my property was fundamental under state law. One prominent attorney posted online, "This is a landmark case of property rights versus bureaucratic overreach. When one man stands up, it sets a precedent for all." The momentum was building, and every shared video clip of my electrified fence and every supportive hashtag added to the chorus demanding that the HOA be held accountable. In a dramatic escalation, the HOA board announced that they would hold a final public hearing to address the controversy once and for all. The meeting was scheduled for a crisp morning just a few days away, a moment that promised to be the turning point for our community. In the days leading up to the hearing, online petitions surged, and neighborhood forums were flooded with debates on the proper use of property rights. Digital polls showed an overwhelming majority of residents supporting my right to protect my land as I saw fit, and the sentiment that individual creativity and independence should be celebrated rather than suppressed was becoming impossible to ignore. Every day, as I patrolled the perimeter of my ranch, I could sense the community's eyes on me. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate me, and phone calls poured in from those who had once felt voiceless under the weight of HOA tyranny. The electrified fence wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a symbol, a beacon that illuminated the fundamental truth that my property was mine to manage as I saw fit. And with each passing day, the mounting digital evidence, the passionate public outcry, and the resolute determination of the residents of Oakwood Meadows pressed the HOA board to re-examine its policies. The final public hearing was billed as the decisive moment for reform. Residents gathered in record numbers at the community center, their faces a mix of hope, anger, and determination. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the promise of change. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine whether the old ways of arbitrary enforcement would continue, or if a new era of accountability and individual rights would finally take hold. The decisive moment arrived on a brisk morning in a packed boardroom at the Oakwood Meadows Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local police representatives, community leaders, and residents from every corner of our neighborhood, each one eager to witness the final vote that would determine the future of property rights in Oakwood Meadows. With an air of calm authority and a resolve forged through months of struggle, Councilwoman Rebecca Turner stepped up to the podium, her eyes scanning the expectant crowd. After a comprehensive review of all digital evidence, security footage, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an unequivocal conclusion. Councilwoman Turner began, her voice steady and resolute. It is clear that the decision to declare your name, ranch as community land was based on misguided assumptions and a blatant disregard for individual property rights. The evidence unequivocally shows that the ranch is privately owned and that every attempt to impose communal control was not only unjustified, but a flagrant abuse of authority. A heavy silence fell over the room as Turner continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind its declaration and any fines or sanctions arising from it. Furthermore, we will be launching a full disciplinary review of the procedures that allowed such an overreach. Our community must be governed by transparency, fairness, and respect for the rights of every individual. Her words resonated with the room, and murmurs of approval rippled through the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, a longtime champion of property rights, rose to speak. "Today we stand together in defense of our freedoms," he declared, his voice filled with passion. "No one, regardless of the weight of community bureaucracy, should have the power to seize private property under the guise of public good. Let this be a turning point where we reaffirm our commitment to justice, individual liberty, and the sanctity of private ownership." His proclamation was met with a thunderous round of applause, uniting the room in a shared resolve. Following this, a senior police official presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of digital evidence, internal logs, and multiple eyewitness testimonies that confirmed, without a doubt, the private ownership of the ranch. The evidence was irrefutable. The ranch had been in my family for generations, and every attempt to convert it to community land was a grave violation of property rights. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict measures against those responsible for the overreach, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure total transparency. Councilwoman Turner concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Oakwood Meadows, a community where the rights of individual property owners are respected above all, where bureaucratic overreach is held in check, and where justice prevails." Today's vote is not merely about reversing an erroneous decision. It is a declaration that our community stands for the principles of freedom and accountability. We will no longer tolerate the misuse of power. Her final words, delivered with unyielding conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom reflected shock, determination, and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community had forced a decisive action that would forever alter the way Oakwood Meadows was governed. The turning point was clear. The days of imposing communal control over private land were over, and a future built on respect for individual ownership was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic decision, Oakwood Meadows began to transform in ways that resonated far beyond the borders of my ranch. News of the HOA board's reversal and the complete rescission of their community land declaration spread rapidly through local media and social networks, igniting impassioned discussions about property rights, governmental overreach, and the power of community solidarity. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance as residents gathered to celebrate the victory of individual freedom over bureaucratic tyranny. Editorials in the local paper, with headlines like "A New Dawn for Oakwood Meadows and Private Property, Public Pride," praised the decisive action taken by the HOA board. Hashtags such as #PropertyRights, #NoMoreOverreach, and #CommunityFreedom trended across social platforms, reinforcing the community's renewed commitment to upholding the sanctity of private ownership. Within the reformed HOA board and the local police department, sweeping changes were implemented with remarkable speed. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, introduced comprehensive training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, ethical conduct, and the proper management of community resources. Regular internal audits and a transparent disciplinary process were established, ensuring that every complaint would be scrutinized and that the rights of every property owner would be rigorously defended. "Our duty is to protect the freedoms of our community," Lieutenant Reed declared at a follow-up press conference, reaffirming that fairness and accountability were now the cornerstones of our governance. Community leaders and civil rights organizations also mobilized to ensure that the lessons of this episode would lead to lasting change. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were launched to promote awareness about individual rights and to empower residents to stand up against any form of bureaucratic overreach. "When we unite, no one can strip away our freedoms," one activist declared at a packed town hall meeting, inspiring a renewed sense of community pride. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to challenge the HOA's declaration, a decision to stand firm and install electrified fences to protect my land, had not only reclaimed my property rights, but had sparked a broader movement. Neighbors, once intimidated by the relentless enforcement of arbitrary rules, now found their voices. They shared stories of their own struggles against overreach, and together we forged a united front that celebrated the principles of personal freedom and the inviolability of private property. Karen Whitfield, once the unstoppable enforcer of HOA decrees, was now a cautionary tale. Her record of intrusive complaints and overzealous interventions, once shrouded in the veneer of authority, was now laid bare for all to see. Digital archives of her past misdeeds emerged, and many residents, previously too fearful to speak out, now rallied behind the movement for reform. Her influence within Oakwood Meadows waned rapidly, and she became a symbol of what happens when unchecked power is met with a unified community ready to demand accountability. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Oakwood Meadows, residents, officials, and community advocates gathered under the glow of a setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Private Property," was unfurled between venerable oak trees, and heartfelt speeches resonated with promises of a brighter future. Today, we celebrate the victory of our rights over bureaucratic overreach, Councilwoman Turner proclaimed, her voice ringing with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation that our community was ready to embrace a future where every resident's property was respected and every act of tyranny was met with collective defiance. As each new day dawned over Oakwood Meadows, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of progress. The story of how the HOA's attempt to reclassify my ranch was defeated by my electrified fences and my unwavering stance on property rights became a rallying cry, a reminder that when a community stands together, no overreach can prevail. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Oakwood Meadows, the rights of the individual will always be defended against the encroachments of the few. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more committed to a future where individual freedom is celebrated and every attempt to seize our rights is met with resolute opposition. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that in Oakwood Meadows, truth, freedom, and respect would forever light our way.